Come on in to Margaret McSweeney's Kitchen for Kitchen Chat, where every week you'll meet chefs, cookbook authors, foodies, gourmets, and just plain people who love to eat. And along with laughter, chat, recipes, and stories about food, you'll sometimes also hear words of inspiration, love, and hope. As Margaret always says, Kitchen Chat is food for the senses and food for the soul. So grab a cup of coffee, put your feet up on a comfy chair, and get ready to spend a little time with Margaret and her friends.
Hello, dear foodie friends, and welcome to Kitchen Chat. I'm your host, Margaret McSweeney, and I am so excited to share the joy of cooking with the great grandson, John Becker, and his wife, Megan Scott, here in Chicago. First of all, welcome to Chicago.
Oh, thank you so much.
Well, everyone knows about the joy of cooking, and so many stories are coming out already saying, oh, I remember Louise was sharing her first recipe from the book was the baked chicken, and then Karen from New York was talking about how she loved the pancakes, and your family, this family legacy created so many taste memories for all of us growing up. And what's extra special, as many of the listeners and viewers know, the reason I do Kitchen Chat is to honor my late father, who was a wonderful gourmet home chef. And my biggest regret in life was not going in the kitchen with him to cook. And he exuded joy and had the joy of cooking in our kitchen. So it's just such an honor to understand what this joy is all about.
Yeah, it seems like we have something in common. I was never able to meet Marian or Irma, and I feel like, in addition to, I felt a lot of motivations for doing this project, but one of them was to try to, really connect with Irma and Marian in the only way that, I knew how. So yeah, no, that's amazing that was your motivation for starting this. It's awesome.
Oh, well, thank you. And Megan, you are now part of the Joy of Cooking family. Can you share with us about that?
Sure. So I met John in 2010. I was working at a bakery in Asheville, North Carolina, and a coworker of mine, I was talking with him about the joy of cooking because it was the first cookbook I ever purchased for myself. And I had a lot of really great first cooking experiences with Joy of Cooking. Like I roasted my first chicken using the instructions in Joy of Cooking.
There's a chicken thread that's slowly becoming...
But I was talking to a coworker about this, and he said, well, didn't you know that the guy whose family wrote The Joy of Cooking works at that coffee shop down the street? And I could not believe that could be true. So as soon as I got off my shift at the bakery, I went down to the coffee shop, which I had been a regular at because, I would go there to do homework or read. And so I kind of knew all the baristas, but I asked the barista behind the counter if he knew anything about that. And it happened to be John, who was working, and he sort of blushed and was like, yeah, that's my family. And I was just overwhelmed and amazed, and we had some more conversations, and then
your coworker wasn't lying.
No, I thought he was, I couldn't believe it. But I ended up asking John out on a date, and we hit it off, and that's how that got started.
I love that. So you found your joy with Joy of Cooking. And John, if we could just go way back into the family legacy here. Yeah. How did this all begin with Irma? And why was she so joyful in the kitchen?
So Irma, she was a housewife. Her two children were out of the house, and unfortunately, her husband Edgar was very sick with cancer. Also was dealing with some probably undiagnosed, especially at the time, undiagnosed psychological problems. Probably was depression. At any rate, he committed suicide. Very sad. Especially for the origin story of something that's called The Joy of Cooking. It's kind of a dark, macabre beginning. But Irma was of a generation of women who did not have any professional training, which just wasn't expected. Mm-hmm. Maybe there were a few of Irma's contemporaries who would go off to college, but she was not one of them. She kind of had the she was brought up to be a lady. And so she had, she did the European tour, and visited some relatives in Germany, because her parents had emigrated. And so, she was worldly, but she was not, did not have any really marketable skills. So, she was, in her 50s? She was in her 50s, and, Edgar had left her with, I guess it would be the equivalent of a year's salary. She took half of that, and despite the fact that she had, she was not renowned for her cooking abilities, she was a renowned hostess. Renowned as in like people had a good time at her parties, but yeah, not necessarily the first person you would think to like, I could obviously see her writing a cookbook, but for whatever reason, she decided that she was onto something, and so she self-published the first edition, had it privately printed, and then basically sold it by hand, both to, obviously to family and friends who were more than happy to help her out, considering the circumstances, but also, she would go around to bookstores and, like, try to get them to buy copies so that they would sell them. And eventually, Bobbs-Merrill, a no longer publishing giant of the Midwest, was interested, and they ended up publishing the second edition in 1936, which, the first edition was like maybe, 300 and change pages, maybe 400 recipes or something like that. I haven't counted them, but it's a modest amount compared to what was to come. The next edition was 2,500 recipes. So yeah, that was
and she would test each recipe.
Yeah.
Yeah, she did. And she had a little cabin in the Ozarks, and she would go to her cabin in the summer and test recipes there, as well as in her apartment in St. Louis.
This is an incredible story.
Yeah, no, it's really kind of out of nothing, like ex nihilo. For me, it's kind of miraculous that she was able to do this. I don't understand how, but yeah, it's just something that I had to accept.
And it's the family legacy.
Right.
And so did she and Julia Child get a chance to meet?
Julia and Irma did meet in Paris.
And then, so Marion, her daughter, Irma's daughter, actually, she did the paper cuts for the original. So yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, this is the 1931.
This is the cover of the 1931 edition.
This is amazing.
Yeah, Marianne did the paper cuttings for the dust jacket, as well as the chapter headings, which we actually have paper cuts in the new edition for the chapter headings as well, to kind of harken back to that without having like some sort of kitschy recipes. But so she published the 1936 edition, and then after that came the 1943 edition, and of course that was published during World War II. So there was information on how to cope with rationing, as well as there was also a lot of recipes that included or utilized canned goods, which were kind of the kitchen hack of the day, I guess. Definitely like new on the scene, and for Irma, who was like the consummate entertainer, it meant that she had to spend less time in the kitchen, and she was all about that.
And I think that's part of the joy of cooking for Irma was being able to cook something and get out of the kitchen as soon as possible to return to the party and be with her friends and family. I also think part of me thinks that the joy of cooking is a little bit of a, I don't know, I don't think ironic is the right word, but I think, Irma was a very witty, intelligent person, and, cooking wasn't something she necessarily loved for the sake of cooking, but I think that she could see the joy in it, or, at the time, cooking was kind of seen as like a drudgery that you had to do. And I think she wanted to inject some humor and fun into the process with her. She was a remarkably witty person. And so that's what made the first edition of Joy of Cooking so unique, was that most cookbooks at the time were a bit dry. They were sort of like home economics manuals. And Irma really wanted to bring her personality and voice into the cookbook, and which she did, which is one of the reasons why her readers loved the book so much.
Oh, and why the readers of the new generation will love this book. And let's dive into this joy. I love how a lot of things have been updated. Can you share some of the highlights of what's new and maybe some of the recipes we said goodbye to?
Sure. Well, I mean, it's hard to narrow down, but because we really did go through the entire book line by line, we created a very detailed outline after going through the book multiple times. And this was after, so when we started working for the family, we were basically just testing recipes out of the last edition. We wanted to cook through the book. And so during that process, we made these genealogies of the recipes just to trace back to which edition they were added and maybe how they had changed. So that was like the first step to us doing this revision. And then, after that, and then also we helped develop an app which involved basically taking the book apart and then putting it back together. After that, we started to get a sense of like what we wanted to do, and we created this really detailed outline. And so really like every section has been updated in some way, whether that's like whether or not that's like taking away a recipe that we felt was like a little long in the tooth, or, just fact checking all of the information we have and the copious amounts of reference material. It really is just kind of a ground up, not rethinking. I guess you would say that we just really wanted to improve all of it. And
we didn't want to take anything for granted. We didn't want to assume that anything was, correct. We wanted to just make sure everything was up to date. And like John said, a lot of fact checking and a lot of research went into this edition because we really wanted to ensure that our readers have the most up to date information. And in terms of things that are new, things that we've changed, in addition to just updating all the reference material and adding 600 new recipes, I know it's a lot. We also added a section on fermentation, which is completely new. We added gram weights to the baking chapters. What else? We expanded our coverage of other preservation techniques such as canning, salting, smoking, drying, all those things that Joy of Cooking is known for, kind of as the desert island cookbook.
Yes, I love that, the desert island cookbook. And I'm so thrilled, too, about how many recipes for vegan, vegetarian have been added as well.
Absolutely, yeah. No, that was definitely a priority for us. In addition to recipes that were specifically meant for those to be vegan and vegetarian, we've also tried to include in head notes ways to make ones that are maybe not, to just point to substitutions or just variations where you can make them that way. So that way, we're not necessarily like, not every recipe that can be made vegan is going to have vegan in the title, right. But especially our vegetable chapter is it's always been extensive. It's a alphabetical by vegetable chapter, so it's a very systematic collection of recipes. I mean, it's almost its own cookbook. You could say that about a few chapters in there. The meat chapter, I mean, it definitely, by the time we were done with it, it felt like its own cookbook. Just because it took a super long time. It was a ton of research. Getting back to the vegetable chapter, yes. We were talking earlier about how you hadn't been to Portland yet, but you'd heard about the farmers markets. And that's definitely that was a huge influence on us. And we really tried to cover all of the interesting varieties of produce that you can now find at farmers markets. And so, definitely that was in addition to researching, the Know Your Ingredients chapter was a fantastic thing for us to research, just because it was just one rabbit hole after another that, deep dive after deep dive. But the vegetable chapter also was just fantastic for that. Had a really good time doing it.
What new vegetable was added?
Well, let's see. Celtis?
Yes, Celtis is new.
And what is Celtis?
It's a stem lettuce. So it's a variety of lettuce that's grown for its stem. It's primarily a Chinese. It's actually, I think it actually is of European origin, but for some reason, it fell out
heavily used in
Chinese cooking, and not so much in European cooking. But it's really great. It has a very kind of firm it's firm textured.
It's crunchy,
crunchy,
a little bit sweet and nutty.
Nutty. It's
Yeah.
a very interesting vegetable for sure.
But we also just expanded our coverage of vegetables that were already discussed. For example, the section on mushrooms.
Yes.
I think in the last edition there were maybe a dozen, or maybe not even a dozen, maybe like 8 varieties covered, and now we cover, I think, like 18 to 20 varieties of mushrooms. You know, mushrooms are such a huge thing in the Pacific Northwest, so we wanted to cover as many varieties as possible. So really, it was a matter of expanding our coverage on all these different types of vegetables. And I'm trying to think if there were any other absolute new ones, but
Yeah,
I can't remember.
Yeah, that's tough.
As a pastry chef, were there any additional pastries added to the book?
Absolutely. We added a recipe for Queen Amman, which are the Breton, they're like croissants, but they are folded. When they're folded during the process, you fold sugar into the dough, and then you kind of shape them in a different way, and they are just these really beautiful caramel. They get the sugar melts and kind of caramelizes.
It's fantastic.
So delicious. We added a recipe for cannelé. That was probably one of the recipes that was the hardest. We tested that upwards of
At least a dozen
times.
Yeah. I mean, all of the tests were edible, but we weren't satisfied with like the result. There are a few places in Portland that do excellent cannelé, and we just had to. It wasn't measuring up, so we had to keep on working at it.
Well, I know we all said goodbye to a few recipes. Was it the wiggly shrimp?
Oh, shrimp wiggle. Yes. Truly, I think, it was best to leave that recipe in the past. It's okay. We can say goodbye to recipes.
Yeah. No, that was a retro. It was a kind of a retro touch from the last edition. And it was already kind of antiquated when it went back in, and we just decided it was time to take that away. Mm-hmm. But there are like lots of other more subtle ways that we kind of whittled down on the older material just by offering like one basic recipe and then having like an additions to that recipe section. I'm trying to think of a good example.
One example of that would be the stuffing recipe. So we have a recipe for like basic bread stuffing. And then in the previous editions, there would be half a dozen variation recipes based on that one. But what we did was we kept the basic recipe, and then we turned all the variations into a list of optional ingredients that you can add to the stuffing to kind of make it different or make it the way you want to make it. So rather than taking up all the space with those additions, we just kind of give a list of optional ingredients.
So it's like just being more efficient, and that's to make room for new material.
And you talk about talking about making things more efficient, streamlining. Can you share with us about that concept in the book?
Sure. It's a new chapter. The title of the chapter is Streamlined Cooking, and it's actually taken from a book that Irma published in 1939. Not part of Joy of Cooking canon necessarily, but a lot of the recipes in the 1943 edition that used canned goods are actually from Streamlined Cooking. And so, like I was saying, how that was like the newfangled technological hack of the day. We felt like we just wanted to repurpose that concept, just as far as like, instead of thinking about using convenience products or trying to buy pre-made things, like how do you make cooking a practice rather than a performance? So instead of like starting over from scratch every time and like, got to make a grocery list, got to go to the grocery store, got to make sure I have everything on the list, and then I'm going to go home and follow this recipe. I mean, that's a great way to learn how to cook a recipe, especially for the first time, and it's how we all learn. But doing that day in and day out is, it's just tiring. It's really tiring, and that's probably, I'm armchairing this, but I think that that's probably what turns people off the most about making a habit of cooking. So what we wanted to do was provide some strategies for how to. It's not just meal prep or meal planning. It's more like it's a little bit of both. So let's say you make a batch of beans. Like let's say you cook a pound of chickpeas. How do you use that throughout the week? How do you reinvent it, I guess? So like the first night you have a chana masala, or maybe even just a spicy chickpea soup. The next night, you could repurpose, like if you made the chana masala, you could maybe bake some sweet potatoes and then fill it with the chana masala for like another way of using that, or maybe even just start over with a chickpea, like whatever chickpeas you have left over, and make like I think we have a really good recipe for a roasted cauliflower and chickpea salad. Mm-hmm. It was just fantastic. But yeah, just like ideas like that, and of course, like we try to give some examples, just I think 5. Like kind of like throughout the week, this is how you would use, like for instance, a roasted chicken, or this is how you would repurpose like a slow roasted salmon fillet, or yeah.
But it's also it's about creatively using leftovers or strategically cooking so that you don't have to start from scratch every single night. But also, how do you use kitchen scraps or, leftover things that you might normally throw away? How do you kind of strategize? So that's what that whole chapter is about, is kind of developing the practice of cooking to get yourself in the kitchen more, but with a little bit less effort.
And hopefully, like, less money.
Yes. And I love that this is such a reflection of your generation as well with the streamline. Well, meal planning goes for everyone, but being conscious about wasting food, because there's so much food waste here. So that is so great to see that element in here too. Well, as we all know, the joy of cooking connects us all. Can you share with us some heartfelt stories that you have heard throughout this joyful journey from how it impacted people's lives?
We had no idea. I personally had no idea, like, the kind of connections that we would have with complete strangers. I mean, I realized, at a pretty young age that a lot of people have had the joy of cooking in their homes, or like their mothers or grandmothers had passed them down. But it really, there's that one person who I just keep on going back to that I can't get over. But this lady, she was going into a nursing home. She had a paperback edition of the 1963. And she sent it to us, and it was like in a Ziploc, because it was literally like destroyed. Like, you would have to like kind of, it was not a flip through it. It's more like, okay, I'm going to put this page over there, just keep, if you wanted to actually use it. And she accompanied it with a note, and basically saying like, this is in such horrible shape that I just don't think that my daughters are going to, really appreciate it. But I just wanted to send this back to you and let you know that this book has gotten me through, 3 marriages, has helped me raise 6 children, has been through a flood. just all of this really, it was just like not a life story. It sounded like, several life stories, like all in one. And she was just like, I just wanted to let you and your family know that you really have helped me, that, you've always been there for me. And it was just like one of the most touching things we've ever gotten. But we've had emails that have, some of the emails are, equally touching.
A young woman who I think she was in middle school, and she started to have chronic migraines and couldn't play the sports. She loved playing sports, but she just couldn't play sports anymore because of this condition. So kind of as a new hobby, she started baking. And she used the joy of cooking, and she wrote us a note telling us how much she loved the book. And I think we ended up sending her a birthday card. And so you just have these really amazing interactions with people that you never would have met otherwise through the book. And it's incredible to see how it's touched so many different people over the years.
And it definitely raised the stakes for us, just having to, just trying to improve, quote, I'm sure that not everybody's going to think of it as an improvement. Because you can't please everybody, but definitely, it really added to our sense of what we were dealing with. That, having grown up with it, you can only know so much about that. until you start interacting with our readers. I feel like we really have a special relationship, a unique relationship with our readers.
And I just think this is such a hug from heaven. That's something I like to call on this journey that I've had in understanding my father's joy of cooking, to be able to meet the legacy of the joy of cooking. But how wonderful that your great-grandmother continues, and now through this generation, to bring people around the world around the table, to share meals and conversations and special moments with family and friends. That's such an incredible legacy, truly.
No, it is. We're incredibly lucky, and working on something like this. Even when I wasn't thinking of following in Irma or Marion or Ethan's footsteps, I couldn't have dreamt of like a more meaningful project to do. It's brought a lot of direction to my life. It's helped me utilize a lot of skills that I thought I would never use.
And cook how many thousands of test recipes?
Before we'd even started the revision, we had tested about 1,500 recipes. So it's hard to even believe that myself.
Just give yourself, enough time and
Yes. Well, I always like to end the show with the top 3 tips for the home chef. But I think in this case, what are the top 3 tips for the joy of cooking, for the home chef to find the joy of cooking?
I think
lower the stakes.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to make some mistakes, and realize that, it's just food. I really think that, the bar is so high in a lot of people's minds, whether it's like from watching too many competition shows to, just feeling just intimidated by the kitchen, or by, just take it one step at a time, and, it's, and also sharpen your knives.
Yes. I would also say, mistakes are frustrating, and things that don't turn out well can be frustrating, but when you make a mistake, it's an opportunity to learn. And some of my biggest, learning moments in the kitchen have been because I totally messed something up. So I think, allow yourself to be upset for a minute, but then say, okay, what have I learned from this experience? And that is where you're going to find, I think, part of the joy of cooking is just that everyday learning opportunity that you get in the kitchen.
Thank you so much, John
Was that 3?
I think 3. We can add in a bonus if you have a bonus, Joy.
Add more garlic. I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both, John Becker and Megan Scott, for sharing the joy of cooking. Dear foodie friends, I'm going to make sure that we have a link to this fabulous new book. Make sure you get it, especially with the holiday season, and it's a great gift for any occasion. But thank you so much for being on Kitchen Chat.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much.
And thank you, dear foodie friends, and always remember to take a moment and savor the day.
Thanks for joining Margaret for Kitchen Chat today. Margaret would be so excited for you to drop by and visit with her at kitchenchat.info, where you'll enjoy podcasts, blogs, recipes, tips from chefs, and even great giveaways. She invites you to share your recipes and kitchen stories too. As Margaret always says, savor the day.